So every time I talk about data storytelling, I like to start off with this quote by Hans Rosling. And if anyone here is not familiar with him, I highly encourage you to read his book, Google him up. He's a master storyteller beyond being also an academician and a physician. I learned a lot about data storytelling from him, and I think anyone can learn a ton. And what he said very succinctly, but that has a lot of meaning, was don't just show the notes, play the music. And I think many times when we start off, when we are deep into working with data, we tend to be prone to show the notes, as in show the data, show the numbers, or just show the charts. And creating charts or showing charts is never really our goal. That's just the means to an end, or that's just a tool to our end goal most of the times, which is to tell a story, to create something, an insight that drives action, right? To help your audience make a decision. Creating charts in itself can be useless if they don't have a meaning that reaches that end goal. So I will walk you through a brief scenario. Let's say that your name is Jim. You just got a new job. You're in your second week on your new job, and you're a senior analyst. And you're eager to prove yourself, work hard, new job, and your manager calls to her office and says, "Hey, Jim, I just got off a call with the HR team. They have some new data sheets in Excel. I want you to take a look at those data files, analyze them, and put together a few slides that we can take back and present to the HR team." And if you are like the typical analyst that I've been and I've seen, you would typically take this approach with some variations here and there. But largely speaking, you would typically look into the methodology. You try to understand, where does the data come from? How was the data collected? Let's say that in this case, we are working with a survey, right? You would try to understand the methodology of collecting the data. Then you would clean up the data, analyze the numbers. Then you would move into the next stage, trying to understand what the numbers mean. So what insights can you uncover? And then finally, you would think, okay, well, what can I recommend using these insights and using these data points? And there's nothing wrong with this approach per se, but if you start off looking at the data and working with data, being in the analyst's shoes, and not being in your audience's shoes, you are very likely to put together a presentation that follows your pattern of thinking or your approach of looking at the data. So then you're very likely to put together a presentation that follows exactly these stages and has these specific chapters, which is not ideal because, one, you didn't start off thinking about your audience, and two, you did not start off thinking, why am I even analyzing this data? What kind of question am I trying to answer? Or what kind of challenge is my HR department trying to solve? Without that, your whole presentation could be totally off, potentially. So then what you can and should do is to think about how you marry two big components or two big topics, storytelling and data. And I know that many times we can think of those two as being, coming from two different worlds, just because we are used to working with data and maybe we are used to being entertained by storytelling, but I think they should come together. And literally inspiration is everywhere. So if you were Jim, the Jim that I mentioned, you could be this Jim Carrey, and you could be funny if you want, but don't be the Jim that is a senior analyst and follows this approach. So in terms of inspiration, right? How can you be inspired when it comes to building a story? So I think that we grew up with storytelling. Literally, storytelling is everywhere around us. When you were a kid, likely your parents read bedtime stories to you, right? This is an example of a book, and there's storytelling in there. Later on, maybe you were a teenager, you watched Seinfeld, or maybe a different sitcom that was your favorite. Maybe mine was Seinfeld, maybe. And then, now you're in lockdown. Maybe you're missing going to the opera and you are live streaming it from your living room. Regardless of the medium that you use to just absorb storytelling, or regardless of the format of storytelling, there is a pattern that all types of storytelling follow, and that pattern can be applied and should be applied, I would argue, to data, to tell a story with data. So I personally spent a ton of time, and by a ton of time, I mean hours and hours watching documentaries. That was my choice of storytelling. And I took what I learned from documentaries and tried to actively apply that to data storytelling. And given that this is a tiny talk, 5 minutes, I'll show you the structure, what I call the anatomy of data storytelling, and how to incorporate the narrative that I found in storytelling in documentaries to data storytelling. So I think the key, once you understand the business question and once you truly understand what your audience is looking for and what kind of challenge your audience is trying to solve, the key is to have an introduction that really, really captures their interest. You have to think, how can you summarize your audience's needs and the business question or the business challenge in 2-3 sentences, and then use those keywords and those sentences in the intro. So then it's clear from the get-go that you're speaking your audience's language. And that should be, again, very succinct. And once you do that, you move into what in storytelling in general is called conflict. Applied to data is basically your graphs, your story unfolding step by step. And to do that, you can use a few different tools that are commonly used in all types of storytelling. One of them is comparisons. You could have charts that show, for example, prior year versus this year. And then you could emphasize on whether your metrics increase, decrease, and why. Or you could build your story going from macro to micro, or vice versa, from micro to macro. And that will engage your audience, because your audience will get you to the point where they will anticipate or try to anticipate what's next. And they will be curious to see how that story unfolds. And then examples are very powerful. If you have a personal example that's very relatable, I highly recommend including that. Or maybe if you work with survey data, you can pull some of the open-ended answers just to help bring the data to life, because data in itself and numbers are just abstract, right? You need to make sure that they become more tangible for your audience. And then of course that you speak your audience's language while doing so. And then as you move to the resolution, it's important to kind of come full circle, not just provide recommendation or recommendations, but go back to that introduction, go back to that problem, and iterate how what you've shown through the narrative, through the middle phase where the events were unfolding, how does that really solve the problem? Or how does that answer the question that your audience started with? And this is the anatomy. I applied this to a few different presentations. I know it works. So I highly encourage you to try to apply it. Maybe take a presentation that you have already and try to think, how could you adjust this to follow this anatomy of data storytelling? And with having said that, please keep in touch. If you wanna reach out, you can find me at Rebeca Pop on LinkedIn, or you can find the Viz Talks channel on YouTube or my website viztalks.com. And that's about it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Rebeca. That was great. Really interesting talk. We'll just see if any questions come in. While we do, I've got a question. What process do you use to really understand your audience's needs when you're putting yourself in their shoes? Is there any particular approach you take?
Yeah, so I actually have a spreadsheet that I use, and that I use also when I teach about how to understand your audience, which has a few different parameters. To mention a few, the level of data literacy, I think that's very important. If you estimate that that's maybe lower, then you should spend a bit more time maybe explaining the type of chart that you have, explaining the type of metrics that you have, to make sure that you're not speaking a language that's not accessible to your audience, or you don't show a graph that's not accessible to your audience. Then things like the size of your audience, the larger your audience, the more generic potentially you would need to be, depending on whether they come maybe from the same department within a company or different departments. Then level of seniority. If your audience is very high up in the organization, likely they don't have a lot of time. So then you have to think how can you summarize your learnings to really the key, the core of what you have to say, so that you don't take too much of their time. Yeah, I have a few more parameters, but those are three of them.
Awesome, thanks, Rebecca. We've got a question come in. If your data set is one that often refreshes, are there any aspects of storytelling that we can use then?
Yeah, I mean, I've worked a lot with data sets that were updated, let's say, on a weekly basis, and it was more of a recurrent report. I would say if you tend to use the same metrics, then the story tends to be similar. You would need to adjust it a little bit, but you would tell a similar story. Maybe, some numbers increase versus decreased week over week. So that would change. But the structure, if you have the same audience, the same metrics, would largely stay the same. And then you would just make tweaks within the story itself.
Cool, makes sense. Thanks, Rebecca. Last one from me. Do you have a recent data story that you've loved, or what's your favorite data story that you've been able to tell?
Yeah, so there's this, talking about documentaries, I mentioned I watched hours and hours of documentaries, literally with pen and paper, trying to take notes and see what I can apply to my data presentations. But there's a series of documentaries, I'll post it, it's called Explained. It's on Netflix. It's super short. It's like 20-25 minutes each episode. It's so powerful. I think just watching that and truly understanding how the story is presented, and I should say they use a ton of graphs. So it's not just visual and verbal. It's actually using a ton of graphs and a ton of data points. But just to see how the intro is presented, how the audience is pulled in, and how you really start getting curious from the beginning. And it really makes you want to watch and try to figure out how the question is answered. And they do pose the question at the beginning of the documentary. And I think that's really a great way to learn about storytelling and then try to apply it to your work with data.
Nice, great tips. I'm a fan of Explained too, so I think that's a good one. I think one more question just had come in from Gold. Obi, what's the most challenging aspect of telling stories with data?
I think the entire process can be challenging, just because, I mean, personally, I believe that us as humans, we tend to be more familiar with our perspective, and it's just hard to step out of our shoes and truly understand what maybe another group of people is interested in, what they are trying to find out, what their challenges are, what the questions that they have are. So I think doing that, it can be hard and can require a lot of questions, and sometimes questions don't get straightforward answers. So then you have to figure out how to ask the right questions in order to get the right answers. And I think it's also hard to spend enough time doing that. Sometimes, we have deadlines, but that's critical though, because without that step or those steps, your entire visualization can, fall through the cracks, because it might not reach the goal that it had, or the goal might not be clear. So I think that's, I guess, long answer short. I think that's hard to really take the time to understand the business question and your audience.